Couching is a beautiful decorative technique that will give your garments a fresh new look. It gives you a freedom of creativity and it's so simple to make. It's a technique where the yarn or cord is applied on the surface of the fabric, giving it a decorative 3D look. While traditionally couching is a hand embroidery technique, we can also create it on our sewing machines. And in today's video, I want to share 3 techniques how you can create couching on your sewing machine. We will begin with the most common method for home sewing and we will finish with a professional solution. This video is created in partnership with Brother and all samples you'll see in today's video are created using Brother Stillair 2 sewing and embroidery machine. So let's begin with the method that is most commonly used at home sewing, and it's using a zigzag stitch. For this technique, all you need is your regular sewing machine setup with universal presser foot, a yarn that you want to attach to your garment, and a matching sewing thread, and also a water-soluble marker. Take your garment and using water-soluble marker, draw lines on the design you want to create. On fuzzy knit fabrics, my regular fabric marker doesn't leave very good lines, so instead I'm using a kids washable marker. It leaves a much clearer line and it will be so much more easy to follow the design lines later on. By the way, my son loves coming into my sewing space and exploring it, so I always keep a pack of washable kids markers and a few sewing tools that are safe for him to play and explore. When drawing the design on existing garment, be aware that in some parts it might be difficult to reach with sewing machines. So let's say the sleeves would be very difficult to reach when doing couching with sewing machine. This is why I am only drawing my design on the parts that I know will be easy to access with my sewing machine. When the design is marked on sewing machine, I'm going to choose a zigzag stitch, which will be the same width or a bit wider than my yarn. Begin by placing yarn under the presser foot and start sewing, following marked design lines with the yarn. The goal is to navigate the yarn to replicate all design lines. When sewing, the zigzag should hug the yarn and firmly attach it to place. In this technique, because we're sewing lots of curves, it's very useful to activate an auto lift presser foot function if your sewing machine has it. You can see that each time I'm stopping to sew, the sewing machine automatically puts the needle in the down position and lifts the presser foot. Then I can very easily pivot the fabric, and when I press the foot controller again, the presser foot automatically lowers, so I don't have to manually keep raising that presser foot lever. So if your sewing machine has this function, this is a very good technique to use it. Also in this technique, because we need lots of accuracy following all these design lines, I have activated a speed control on my sewing machine. And when the speed control is activated, even if I accidentally press the foot controller too hard, the machine won't sew past a certain speed limit. And this is also a very good function to use whenever you're sewing a design like this, when you need extra accuracy. Sewing slower usually turns better results. After the design is stitched, I'll finish with a few back stitches and trim down the remaining yarn. Now, if you would like to create a more clean finish, and if you are sewing this couching on a sweater, you can leave longer yarn thread tails at the beginning and end of your design. So once you finish stitching, you can bring those yarn ends into the garment inside for a more polished look. With this technique, the yarn is kept in place with a zigzag stitch, and the better you match the sewing thread color to the yarn color, the less noticeable the zigzag will be. Also, if you're doing couching on sweaters, I do recommend matching the yarn fiber to the sweater fiber. Let's say if you're going to use wool yarn for couching and you're going to use it on a synthetic sweater, once you wash out the sweater may remain intact, but if you use a too hot water, the wool may shrink, thus ruining the design. So it's best to keep the same fiber in the couching yarn and in the sweater yarn for best results. Additional tip, if you don't want to navigate that yarn all the way throughout your design, alternative method would be to use a fabric temporary glue to attach the yarn following the design lines and then later stitch it out. For me personally, it's better to not do that and just manually navigate the yarn, but this is also a useful tip to remember to try. This this method will work great with uncomplicated designs, and it will add such a lovely detail to your garments. Now let's move on to the second technique, and this is a technique that I actually like more, and it's using a narrow hem foot to help us navigate the yarn. The benefit here is that because the yarn is feeded through the presser foot at the same spot, we can use either a straight stitch or a very narrow zigzag for more concealed look. So in this technique, I used a heart template to draw multiple heart designs on my shirt. I also decided to use a very fussy decorative thread, and because the thread has these very long piles, I didn't want to use a zigzag stitch because it would have just locked those piles to the core of the thread and thus ruining the look. This is why this method, using a straight stitch or a very narrow zigzag, is a much better solution. I took the narrow hem foot and fed my yarn through the hole. If you're working with a thicker yarn, you can use just a straight stitch, but because my yarn is a little bit narrow, I'm going to use a 0.5 millimeter width zigzag so that when I'm curving my design, I can always reach the right spot of the thread. The zigzag is very minimal and it's barely noticeable, but it will keep the design in place better. In this technique, the principle is exactly the same as with the first technique. We're navigating the yarn to follow the design lines and add couching detail on our fabric. After I was done stitching, this is how my shirt looked. Very minimal detail, but it elevated the entire design and gave my very old shirt a fresh new look. Comparing stitching with the first technique, you can notice that in this technique the stitching is less noticeable because we're not using a wide zigzag stitch. And using this narrow hem foot method will work better for a bit more complicated designs because it will make navigating the yarn much easier. Both first and second technique took me about 45 minutes to stitch out. So now I want to show you a third option which is faster and will allow you to tackle even very complicated designs, and it's actually using an embroidery machine couching function. Brothers Layer 2 is a sewing and embroidery machine, and couching is one of the functions I've been wanting to try out since day one of having this machine. First, I'm going to convert from sewing machine to embroidery machine by removing free arm and attaching embroidery module. Then I'm installing a special couching foot that comes with this sewing machine and thread machine with sewing thread and the yarn. At the machine screen, I'm selecting the design I want to stitch out from a variety of special couching designs. Then I added my sweater into a very large hoop and started stitching. Now, because I selected a very large design and I am using this huge embroidery hoop, I actually needed to remove the side seam of my sweater temporarily so that I can hoop in the sweater better and easier. Also, when doing couching on embroidery machine, I use the tearaway stabilizer from the back side to keep everything nicely in shape and protect it from stretching out. And by the way, this is an additional tip that if you're working with stretchy material when doing couching, you can use a tearaway stabilizer and add it to the back side of your design, even if you're doing it on sewing machine, and it will protect the fabric from stretching out. And now the machine stitches out the design while I sit back and just enjoy the process, because couching on embroidery machine just looks very satisfying. After the stitching was done, this is the beautiful result that we get. If we take a closer look at the stitching and compare all three methods, you can see that with this technique, the top sewing thread is virtually invisible, giving a more professional look. Using this technique, you can tackle even very difficult designs, use pre-existing patterns, or create digitalized patterns yourself. The stitching for this large complicated design took total 8 minutes to do on embroidery machine, and of course I did have to use additional time to hoop in the fabric. However, it was still much faster compared to the first two methods, which took about 45 minutes to stitch out each. If you're going to use couching not very often, the first two methods are absolutely fine to use. They give beautiful results, and you can see that it adds such a wonderful detail to any garment that you already have. However, if you plan on doing couching very often, if you want to tackle very difficult designs, or even if you want to use it for a business, then consider using a machine that has this function. It will make the process so much faster, give excellent results, and will allow you to tackle even very difficult designs. I absolutely loved adding couching details to all these free designs, and let me know which one is your favorite. Thank you for joining me in today's video, and if you want to see more creative techniques that you can do with your sewing machine, this is the video that you want to watch next. Thank you again for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye!